The letter arrived on a cold, wind-swept evening, its presence almost more an omen than an invitation. It wasn't just any letter. Its edges were frayed, the parchment thick and strangely warm to the touch, as though it had been pulled from some forgotten, ancient place. Evelyn Gray stared at the elegant handwriting on the envelope, her name written in ink that shimmered like silver under the dim light of her desk lamp. Her heart raced, a mix of excitement and dread as she slowly peeled it open, the chill in the air seeming to deepen despite the warmth of the room. As she read the words inside, a shiver of unease crept up her spine, something unsettled in the very rhythm of the invitation. You are invited to join the prestigious Silverwood Academy of Magic. We are pleased to offer you a teaching position in the coveted Department of Arcane Studies. Your knowledge is invaluable to us, and we believe you are the perfect candidate for this role. The school awaits your arrival at once. Be prepared for challenges beyond your imagination. The letter was signed by Headmistress Morgana Vaylorn, a name that Evelyn had heard only in whispers, a name tied to power, mystery, and a dark fear that clung to it like a shadow. It was an invitation few ever received, a rare offer that few could turn down, and yet, Evelyn felt something twisting in her chest as she read it. The position was everything she had ever wanted, an opportunity to teach the craft she had studied for years, to shape the next generation of witches, to finally belong to a world she had longed for. And yet, there was something off about the letter, something that made her skin crawl, that gnawed at the edges of her reason. It wasn't just the fine print, which hinted at a sense of urgency that felt wrong. It was the strange, almost predatory feeling she had the moment she laid eyes on it. Why did she have to go? Why did it feel like she had no choice, no say in the matter? Her hands trembled as she placed the letter down. She had to go. She had to accept. The pull was too strong, like a thread tugging at her very soul. And even as she questioned it, she knew, somehow, there was no way to refuse. The train ride to the academy felt endless, stretching deep into the dark hours of the night. The world outside the window blurred into a haze of dark trees and empty fields, the landscape slipping past like a dream that couldn't quite be grasped. With every mile, the air seemed to grow heavier, denser, until it almost felt like it was pressing in from all sides. When the train finally screeched to a halt, Evelyn's gaze was immediately drawn to the landscape around her. It had changed. The mist, thick and oppressive, clung to her clothes, wrapping around her like a cold, suffocating blanket. In the distance, the school loomed, a shadow against the gray sky, its twisted towers reaching up into the clouds like the gnarled fingers of a forgotten god. As the doors of the train opened, the ground felt unnaturally still, as if the earth itself had held its breath. Evelyn stepped down onto the gravel platform, the crunch beneath her boots a sharp contrast to the silence surrounding her. She looked around, expecting some sort of welcome, but there was nothing. No one. The air hung heavy with a strange stillness, like the entire world was waiting for something to happen. She pulled her coat tighter around her, trying to shield herself from the chill that seemed to seep into her bones, her eyes nervously flicking toward the dark path that led to the towering gates of Silverwood Academy. The mist swirled unnaturally around her feet, as though it were alive, moving with a mind of its own. There was no welcoming committee, no sign of life, just the cold, oppressive silence, broken only by the distant cawing of a raven perched on one of the stone statues. As she walked toward the gates, a strange sensation crawled up her back, an uncomfortable awareness that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The place felt alive in a way she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the imposing architecture, though every stone seemed to pulse with ancient magic. It was the land itself. The ground beneath her feet shifted, just subtly enough for her to feel it, like the earth was breathing beneath her boots. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, hidden, waiting in the shadows, its presence as tangible as the mist around her. What was it? What was she walking into? The gates creaked open as Evelyn approached, their groan echoing through the stillness. A tall figure stepped forward from the shadows to meet her. The headmistress, Morgana Vaylorn. She was striking, dressed in dark, flowing robes that seemed to ripple like liquid, moving with a life of their own. Her eyes were a piercing shade of green, sharp and calculating. And her smile, it was both welcoming and chilling. as though she could see right through Evelyn. "Welcome, Evelyn," she said, her voice smooth, soothing, and yet cold, as if it could freeze the very air around them. "We've been expecting you." Inside the academy, the sense of unease only deepened. The walls seemed to whisper as Evelyn walked down long, narrow corridors, their sounds muffled but unmistakable, as though the very structure of the building were alive. The students she passed seemed strange, too quiet, too perfectly composed. Their eyes followed her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, but they never spoke, never broke their eerie silence. It was as if they were all watching her, studying her, dissecting her every move. Each step she took felt heavier. Each corner she turned seemed to reveal a deeper, darker layer to the place. The academy was too quiet. The air felt thick, almost oppressive. There was something about the place that unsettled her deeply. Something she couldn't quite put into words, but it felt like the very walls had eyes, as though they were aware of her presence, tracking her every moment. At dinner that night, Evelyn sat at the staff table, surrounded by faces she hadn't yet gotten to know, and noticed how few people were actually present. It was odd, unnervingly so, as though the school's population was far smaller than it should have been. The teachers spoke in hushed tones, their words blending into the low hum of the room, but Evelyn caught fragments of their conversation. They spoke of rules, rules that were sacred, that could never be broken, no matter the cost. "Don't break the rules," one teacher whispered urgently to another. "If you do, you'll never leave this place. Not alive, anyway." The words sent a chill down Evelyn's spine, cold enough to make her shiver despite the warmth of the room. She turned her head, pretending she hadn't heard, her stomach knotting with an unsettling sense of dread. What kind of place had she come to? What kind of rules were they talking about? And why did she feel like she was already breaking them? She tried to ignore the growing unease in her chest, but it gnawed at her, relentless and insistent, making it harder to focus on anything else. The rules they spoke of, what were they? Why did they seem so important, so terrifying? She had to know. She had to understand what lay beneath the surface of this place, what was so dangerous that even the teachers feared it so. As she lay in her bed that night, the whispers of the walls seemed to grow louder, almost as if they were speaking directly to her. The shadows in the corners of her room twisted and swirled, shifting like something alive. For a moment, she thought she saw eyes staring back at her from the darkness, cold and unblinking. Her heart slammed against her ribs, her breath caught in her throat, but when she blinked, the eyes were gone. Still, the feeling of being watched never left her. It lingered, thick and suffocating, as if the academy itself was observing her, waiting for her to make a mistake. But it wasn't just her actions the school was concerned with. It was something darker, something far more dangerous that seemed to lurk just beneath the surface. In the oppressive silence of her room, Evelyn made a decision. She had to learn more, even if it meant uncovering things she wasn't sure she was ready to face. She had to understand why this place felt so wrong, so unnatural. And she would start tomorrow. She would find out about the rules, all of them. She had no choice. But what she didn't realize was that breaking them would be the last thing she ever did. Evelyn woke early the next morning, her mind racing with questions she couldn't shake. The letter, the school, the rules, everything felt wrong, a web of confusion and unease she couldn't untangle. And yet, despite it all, she couldn't stop herself from wanting to know more. After a restless night, filled with strange dreams of twisting corridors and eyes watching from the dark, she was summoned to Headmistress Morgana's office. There, on a heavy wooden desk covered in strange symbols and ancient tomes, lay a thick, leather-bound book. It seemed to pulse with an energy all its own, as though it were alive, breathing in rhythm with her own racing heart. Morgana handed it to her, her smile cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of warmth. "This," Morgana said, her voice both chilling and strangely enticing, "is the Manual of Rules. They are the foundation of Silverwood. You must understand them if you are to teach here." Evelyn took the book, feeling its weight settle into her hands like an anchor. And yet there was something about it that unsettled her. It was as if it were watching her, aware of her every move. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded to near obscurity, yet there was a strange presence to them, something that made her skin prickle with a deep, primal sense of unease. When she looked down at the words, they seemed to shift, like shadows dancing just beyond her reach. The language was unfamiliar, an ancient script she couldn't place, and yet, somehow, she could almost understand it, like a memory that lingered just out of grasp, elusive and intangible. A chill ran down her spine as she turned the first page, the weight of the book growing heavier with each passing second. Morgana's voice echoed in her mind, cold and distant, yet somehow inescapable. "You must understand them, Evelyn. You cannot teach here without them." The words on the page shifted again, and for the briefest moment they seemed to whisper to her, their meaning just within reach. What were these rules? What price would she have to pay to understand them? And more importantly, what would happen if she didn't? "These rules were forged long ago," Morgana explained, her tone sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "They keep the balance of the school, protecting us from forces far darker than you can imagine. If you break them, the consequences are irreversible. Do not test them." Evelyn's fingers trembled as she turned another page, the weight of her responsibility settling heavily on her shoulders. At first glance, the rules seemed harmless enough, simple even. Never speak the name of the void in the halls. Do not leave the school grounds after dusk. Always pay respect to the ancient stones in the courtyard. Easy to follow, at least on the surface. But as she read further, the rules became more complex, their meaning darker. They spoke of boundaries, rituals, and ancient forces that lurked beyond the school's walls, waiting for a mistake, watching, always watching. The more Evelyn read, the more her curiosity deepened. Why did these rules feel so specific, so vital? And why, as she read on, did she feel as though something terrible was hiding just beneath the surface of them, something that the rules were trying to guard against? It wasn't just about keeping the students in line. It felt as if they were meant to protect something, someone, from being unleashed. Something darker, something she couldn't yet grasp. As the days passed, the sense of unease grew stronger, seeping into every corner of the academy. Evelyn began to notice strange things happening around her. Students would vanish for hours, only to return with pale faces and vacant eyes, as though they had seen something that terrified them, or perhaps something they couldn't remember. The classrooms shifted when she wasn't looking. The doors would open to hallways that hadn't been there moments before, as though the very structure of the school was changing, folding in on itself. Whispering voices echoed through the walls at night, soft murmurs that seemed to call her name. She tried to tell herself it was just the wind, just the creaking of the old building, but deep down, she knew better. Something was wrong. And the more she tried to ignore it, the more it pressed in on her, like the walls themselves were closing in. What was she missing? What was the school hiding from her? The answers were just out of reach, but she could feel them, lingering in the shadows, waiting for her to make the wrong move. One evening, as Evelyn made her way through the dimly lit corridors to her office, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. She turned, her breath catching in her throat, but no one was there. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that she could see her breath, and instinctively, she pulled her coat tighter around her. She quickened her pace, her footsteps echoing in the empty hall. That's when she saw him. Lucian Thorncroft, a fellow teacher who had been nothing but distant since her arrival. He stepped out from the shadows, his presence as unnerving as the darkness itself. His dark eyes tracked her every move, intense and knowing, as though he had been waiting for this moment. "You're starting to see it, aren't you?" he said in a low, gravelly voice, his words heavy with meaning. He didn't step any closer, but his gaze felt as though it was pressing into her. His face was pale, his expression unreadable, and there was something about the way he looked at her that sent a chill down her spine. "The school isn't what it seems. Those rules you're reading, don't think for a second they're just guidelines. They are the only thing keeping you safe. Break one, even unknowingly, and the consequences will be more than you can bear." Evelyn hesitated, her mind racing. He knew something she didn't. But should she trust him? He was just as distant as everyone else, and yet there was an edge to his words, a sincerity in his voice that made her stomach tighten. She wanted to ask him so many things, to demand answers, but all that escaped her was a shaky breath. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling more than she wanted to admit, her words barely more than a whisper. Was it fear? Curiosity? Or something else altogether? Lucian didn't answer right away, but his eyes never left hers, and Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she had just opened a door that could never be closed again. Lucian glanced around, his eyes scanning the corridor as if ensuring they were alone before speaking again, his voice low and urgent. "I'm telling you this because you have no idea what you're up against." His words felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, tightening with each syllable, making it hard to breathe. "If you break a rule, you'll never leave this place. Not in any way you'd want to." The gravity of his warning settled over her like a thick fog, heavy and suffocating. But before she could ask him to explain further, he turned, his figure disappearing into the shadows with unnatural swiftness, leaving her standing there in stunned silence. The hallway felt colder now, emptier. She couldn't shake the feeling that his words had carved something deep into her mind, a warning that wouldn't fade, no matter how hard she tried to push it away. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. Her mind churned with thoughts of Lucian's warning, of the strange occurrences around the school, each one more unsettling than the last. There had to be something hidden here, something no one was telling her. What were they all afraid of? What was really behind the rules? The thought gnawed at her, relentless and impossible to ignore. She knew she shouldn't, but the need for answers clawed at her, louder than her rational mind. After everyone had gone to bed, the school lay in an eerie stillness. Evelyn couldn't resist any longer. She ventured out into the hallways, her footsteps loud against the silence, each echo making her feel more exposed, more vulnerable. The darkness around her seemed to stretch and shift, the building feeling less like a school and more like a living, breathing entity. As she walked deeper into the corridors, doors appeared. Doors she had never noticed before, as though they had materialized overnight. The school felt alive, mutating, hiding things from her. Her heart raced in her chest as she approached a heavy, ancient door at the end of a narrow hallway. It stood like a sentinel, sealed with dark, twisted runes that pulsed faintly in the dim light. There was something about it, something that called to her, urging her forward. The need to open it, to see what lay beyond, was almost overwhelming, like a hunger she couldn't ignore. She reached for the door handle, her hand trembling. What if it's a mistake? What if this is the rule I'm meant to never break? But the thought of turning back, of staying in the dark, terrified her more. Slowly, deliberately, she grasped the cold metal, knowing that in a moment, everything could change. Would she regret it? Would the consequences be something she could live with? Or would she be too late to stop what was about to unfold? Her fingers brushed against the cold surface of the door, and for a moment, everything went silent. The whispers in the walls faded, the cold air seemed to still, like the entire school was holding its breath. Evelyn took a step forward, her breath shallow, her mind pulled in two directions, fear and curiosity, both clawing at her. She almost turned the handle, almost broke through the boundary the school had set, when a voice, soft yet powerful, whispered from the shadows. "Don't." The voice was familiar, but it felt distant, almost alien, as though it came from a place she could never reach, a place far beyond her understanding. Evelyn froze, her blood turning to ice, her heart hammering in her chest. The voice called her by name, and yet there was no one in sight. She stepped back instinctively, her hands still trembling on the door, as the air around her seemed to grow colder, darker, pressing in on her from all sides. The voice spoke again, this time with a weight that sank deep into her bones. "Leave it alone. If you go through, you'll never come back." The words felt like they were wrapped in the very essence of the school, as if the building itself was alive, watching, warning, trying to protect her from something far worse than she could understand. Evelyn's throat tightened as she swallowed hard, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had almost done. She didn't know what she had stumbled upon, but she knew now that it was far darker, far more dangerous than anything she had imagined. And yet, the voice in her head, the voice of the school, had told her to turn back, had tried to stop her. But now, there was something else, a deeper, darker pull, something compelling her to move forward, to break through the boundary and discover the truth. What lay behind that door? Was it the answer to all her questions? Or was it a trap waiting to consume her just like it had consumed so many before her? She had a choice, but it didn't feel like one. The truth was within reach, but so was the abyss, and she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lay beyond the door was the key to everything. The school, the rules, and the terrifying power that governed them all. Evelyn couldn't stop thinking about the forbidden door. The voice that had warned her still echoed in her mind, its words haunting her with every passing moment. But her curiosity, her relentless need for answers, clawed at her, refusing to let go. The more she tried to convince herself to leave it alone, the stronger the pull became. There was something in that room, something important, something that could explain all the strange, unnerving things happening at Silverwood. It was just a door, just one rule to break. How bad could it be? That evening, when the school had fallen silent, and the night stretched on with a stillness that felt almost unnatural, Evelyn slipped through the halls, her footsteps light but deliberate. The shadows seemed to watch her, thick and ever-present, and the walls themselves felt alive, breathing, pulsing with a quiet awareness of her every move. Her pulse raced as she approached the sealed door once again, the runes glowing faintly with a sickly light, as though they were waiting for her to make her choice. The air around her crackled, filled with an energy she couldn't explain, something both inviting and terrifying. She didn't stop. Her hand reached for the cold, iron handle, and with a quick, almost involuntary motion, she turned it. As the door creaked open, a rush of icy air swept out, and with it came a wave of dread that seemed to settle deep in her bones. Her stomach twisted, but there was no turning back now. The room inside was swallowed by darkness, the kind that felt thick, almost oppressive, like it was trying to choke the light from her very soul. She stepped inside, and the door groaned as it shut behind her with an unnatural heaviness, sealing her in. The temperature plummeted, the air thickening with an ominous presence, as if she had just crossed into a place that was never meant to be disturbed. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest, and every step she took felt heavier than the last. The darkness seemed to press in on her, making it harder to breathe. Her eyes slowly adjusted, but the shadows stretched further than she could see, hiding whatever lay beyond her immediate view. The room was filled with strange, cryptic symbols etched into the walls, their shapes unnerving, almost alive. And at the far end, standing tall and imposing, was a large, ancient mirror. It gleamed faintly in the dark, its surface reflecting nothing, no light, no shadows, just an endless void. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she moved toward it, feeling an irresistible pull, as though the mirror itself was calling her. What was it? What did it mean? What did it want from her? She couldn't help but step closer, drawn in, her every instinct screaming at her to run. But she didn't. She couldn't. The truth was just a few steps away. She stepped forward, drawn to the mirror, her heart pounding in her chest. The surface wasn't smooth, it rippled like water, twisting and distorting with every movement she made. Her reflection, it didn't look right. It was wrong. There was something off about it, something that didn't belong. Her image flickered, as if the glass was unwilling to show her true self. But what truly caught her attention wasn't her reflection, it was the shadow. A dark shape, standing just behind her, looming over her with long, spindly limbs and glowing red eyes. Her blood ran cold. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat, but there was nothing there. No one. Nothing. Just the same suffocating silence, broken only by the frantic beating of her heart. She gasped, her lungs struggling for air as panic clawed at her chest. The voice, the warning voice, whispered again, this time clearer, sharper, more urgent. Leave this place. But it was already too late. A deafening crash shook the very walls of the school, followed by the sound of doors slamming shut with a force that rattled the bones. The ground beneath her feet trembled, vibrating with a low, menacing hum. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. She had triggered something. The rules weren't just guidelines, they were barriers, and she had shattered them. And now something was awake. Something far worse than she had ever imagined. The walls seemed to shift then, bending and closing in on her like hungry jaws. The air thickened, grew heavier, colder, as though it had become an entity of its own. A presence pressed in from all sides, suffocating her with a chilling weight. Evelyn's skin crawled, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end as a guttural growl echoed from the darkness. She spun, her eyes widening with terror as the creature emerged, slowly at first, like a shadow being birthed from the night itself. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs stretched impossibly long, like the branches of a dead tree reaching for her, dragging the darkness with it. Its skin was like blackened, peeling leather, moving with an unnatural fluidity, its form bending and shifting with every step it took. And those eyes, those blood-red eyes, locked onto hers, piercing into her soul, into the very core of her being, as though it could see all her fears and desires at once. It moved toward her, silent, predatory, its steps smooth and swift like liquid. She stumbled back, her feet scrambling for purchase on the cold floor, but the creature was faster, far faster. With a sharp hiss, the creature lunged at her, its claws slashing through the air. Evelyn barely managed to dodge, the cold brush of its presence grazing her skin. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sprinted down the hallway, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The school seemed to pulse with malice, the walls shifting around her as though it were alive, aware of her every move. Doors slammed shut with an eerie finality, trapping her, suffocating her. She bolted down a staircase, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness, but the creature's pursuit was relentless. The sound of its steps grew louder, closer, faster. The realization hit her like a cold wave. The school wasn't just a building, it was alive. It was reacting to her fear, shaping the very halls to keep her contained. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly before her, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. She looked over her shoulder. The door she had just passed was gone, replaced by narrow, suffocating passages that led nowhere. Her mind reeled, trying to make sense of it, but there was no time. The growls behind her were getting louder, desperate, almost furious. It knew she was slipping away. Her legs screamed for rest, for a moment to catch her breath, but there was no time for that. The walls were closing in, pressing against her, pushing her toward the inevitable. She couldn't stop. She couldn't slow down. Finally, she saw it. A door, just ahead, bathed in dim light, untouched by the madness surrounding her. Desperation surged within her, and with trembling hands, she yanked it open. The cold night air rushed in, biting at her skin, but she didn't stop. She tumbled through the doorway, stumbling onto the misty grounds, gasping for breath. The silence outside was almost unbearable. She stood there for a moment, still feeling the weight of the school's malevolent presence pushing against her, urging her to return. But she didn't. She couldn't. Not yet. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stumbled into the dark woods that surrounded the school, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The whispering voices of the school's rules echoed in her mind, warning her, condemning her. She didn't know what she had unleashed, but she could feel it. Something ancient, something hungry was now awake, and it wasn't just the school that had noticed. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance, Lucian Thorncroft. His silhouette cut through the mist, his movements slow, deliberate. As he approached, his expression was cold, unreadable, his eyes dark with knowledge she couldn't even begin to comprehend. He said nothing as she collapsed to the ground, her hands clutching the dirt beneath her, gasping for air. She didn't need to ask. He already knew. The truth hit her like a wave. The school wasn't just a place of learning. It was a trap. Breaking its rules wasn't just a mistake. It was a death sentence, a binding to something far darker, something alive. And now, she was part of it. Part of the curse that clung to Silverwood. The days blurred as Evelyn found herself trapped in her quarters, hunched over the ancient manual, its weight crushing her. Every time she opened it, the words twisted, shifted, and pulsed before her eyes. The language seemed familiar, yet utterly foreign, like a memory lost in time. But the more she read, the clearer the horror became. The rules weren't just about maintaining order or ensuring safety, they were about control. The school wasn't just a building, it wasn't just a place of magic and knowledge, it was a living, breathing entity. And those rules? They were the chains that kept it fed, kept it alive. And now, she was bound to it. Forever. The rules were designed to trap students in a cycle, ensuring that the school remained powerful and protected from the dark forces lurking beyond. Each rule, no matter how trivial it seemed, was tied to a specific purpose: to keep the school fed, to keep it alive, and to keep its twisted power from slipping out of control. As Evelyn read, a growing dread gnawed at her. She was just another piece in the machine, another offering to the school's endless hunger. But what struck her most was the history, the twisted history of those who had come before her. Teachers, students, even headmasters, all had tried to break the rules or escape. Those who failed didn't just disappear, they became part of the school itself. Some were bound to the walls, their faces frozen in agony. Others were consumed entirely, their very essence twisted into something unrecognizable. The ones who had truly tried to escape, they had been trapped forever, their spirits bound to the halls, their memories erased, doomed to live in the shadows of the very place they had hoped to leave behind. As the weight of this knowledge settled in, Evelyn began to feel the presence of the entity again. At first, it was just a whisper, a cold chill creeping down her spine when she wasn't paying attention. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. It grew stronger, more tangible, and one night, while she was alone in the library, it appeared before her. The entity wasn't just an intangible force anymore. It had taken shape, a horrifying, otherworldly figure that seemed to distort the very air around it. Its form was like smoke, twisting and swirling, with eyes that glowed like burning embers, casting an eerie light in the dim room. It was both terrifying and mesmerizing, its movements fluid and unnatural, as if it were not bound by the laws of reality itself. For a moment, Evelyn could only stare, frozen in place. Then, the entity spoke, its voice low and guttural, like the sound of stone grinding against stone. "You've learned the truth," it said, its words vibrating through her bones. "But the truth is not enough. The school will feed on your fear, just as it has fed on others. You are trapped, and so is it. The rules are not just to control you, they are to control us all." Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short gasps. She wanted to ask it questions, to demand answers, but she knew the entity wasn't here to give them freely. Instead, it seemed to feed off her fear, growing stronger with every moment. But as it loomed over her, a strange realization flickered in the back of her mind. The entity wasn't entirely evil. It wasn't here to torment her for the sake of it. It was trying to warn her, trying to show her something darker lurking at the heart of the school. Before Evelyn could process this new thought, the entity disappeared, leaving behind a lingering chill and an unsettling silence. But the questions it had planted in her mind were only just beginning to take root. What was the entity really? And if it wasn't evil, then what was the true danger of the school? It wasn't long before Lucian Thorncroft appeared again, but this time, there was something different about him. He was no longer the man she had met before, the teacher with an air of mystery. Now, his presence felt darker, more sinister. His eyes were cold, his posture rigid, as though he was carrying a weight that had crushed him over time. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Lucian asked, his voice rough, as though he hadn't spoken in days. "The entity, it's not what you think. It's not your enemy, not really. But the headmistress, Morgana Valorn, she is." Evelyn's mind raced. The headmistress was the one person she had trusted, the one person who had seemed to have control over the chaos that constantly surrounded the school. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her attempts to stay calm. Lucian's eyes hardened. "Morgana Valorn isn't just the headmistress of this school. She is the school. She is tied to its very existence, its power, its hunger. The rules are not just for the students, they are for her too. She's the one who feeds it, who keeps the cycle going. She has lived for centuries, grooming the next generation of teachers and students, preparing them to take her place when the time comes. She's been waiting for you." Evelyn's heart dropped. The room seemed to spin around her, the walls closing in. "What do you mean she's been waiting for me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lucian's expression darkened even further. "You are the new headmistress, Evelyn. She has chosen you. She's been grooming you for this role since the moment you set foot in this place. The rules, the rituals, the cycle, it all leads to this moment. You were never meant to escape. You were meant to take her place when the time comes. And when you do, the school will be hers once again." Evelyn could barely comprehend what he was saying. Her stomach churned, her vision blurred. Was this really happening? Was the school truly alive? Was the headmistress, Morgana, not just a witch, but something far worse? Something that had been manipulating her, using her for her own dark purposes? And if she was meant to be the next headmistress, what would that make her? A puppet? A prisoner? As the pieces began to fall into place, Evelyn realized with a sickening certainty that the rules were not just guidelines. They were the chains that kept the school alive, that kept Morgana alive. And breaking them? That was never an option. Not for anyone. Evelyn could feel the weight of the knowledge pressing down on her. Each day she spent researching the history of the school, the more her dread grew. The final ritual, the one that must be performed every year, was the most horrifying thing she had ever come across. It was a sacrifice, a blood offering that the school demanded to remain alive and protect itself from the dark forces that lurked just beyond its walls. She could hardly believe what she was reading. The students, the teachers, and even the headmistress were all part of this unholy pact, their lives bound to the school in ways she hadn't even imagined. The worst part was that she was marked. She had always been marked, from the moment she stepped foot inside the gates. She had been chosen to take part in the ritual, whether she wanted to or not. The more Evelyn learned, the more the horror of her situation sank in. The school was not just a place of education, it was a prison, and everyone trapped inside it, whether they were students or staff, was part of a dark cycle that could never be broken. The rules, the rituals, the seemingly endless power of the place all existed to ensure that the pact remained in place. Every year, a fresh sacrifice was required to renew it, to keep the school from crumbling to dust. Evelyn had thought she was here to teach, to guide young witches, but now she understood the terrible truth. She was here to be the offering. Faces of previous students and teachers started appearing in her mind. She saw them everywhere. Empty eyes staring out from behind her closed eyelids, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Their hollow eyes followed her wherever she went, even in the safety of her own room. She could no longer tell if they were just memories or something far worse. Their faces were etched with a hollow, lifeless expression that made her skin crawl. They were the ones who had failed to escape, the ones who had come before her and been consumed by the school, trapped in its dark, eternal cycle. Evelyn could feel them, their spirits, trapped in the walls, their whispered warnings like echoes in the corners of her mind. But she couldn't just sit and wait for her fate to unfold. She had to escape. She had to try, at least. It was her only choice. Evelyn spent days planning, trying to figure out a way out. The idea of escaping the school, of breaking free from its deadly grip, consumed her every thought. But every time she tried to leave, the school fought back. The doors slammed shut. The walls seemed to shift, moving and twisting as if they had a mind of their own. The hallway she had walked down for hours now seemed unfamiliar, as if it had changed completely in the time it took for her to walk back. The entity was always there, watching, waiting. No matter where she went, no matter what path she tried to take, it was always just behind her, its dark, heavy presence pressing down on her. It wasn't just the entity that stood in her way. It was the school itself. The ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, like the very earth was alive and watching her every step. Rooms shifted when she wasn't looking, and corridors seemed to lead nowhere, or worse, to places she had already been. The air grew thick with a strange, unnatural heaviness, making it harder to breathe. She couldn't even tell what was real anymore. Was she still in the school? Or had she fallen into some kind of nightmare from which there was no escape? Desperation clawed at her as she tried to break through the gates of the school. She could see them in the distance, the iron bars that separated her from freedom. Her heart raced with hope. She ran, her feet pounding against the ground until she reached the gates. They were close, so close she could almost taste the freedom that waited beyond them. But when she reached for the gate, it didn't open. She pushed harder, tugging with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. That's when she noticed something terrifying. The road beyond the gate wasn't what it should have been. It stretched on, disappearing into the distance. But when she turned around to look back at the school, she realized with horror that the road behind her was gone. There was no going back. She was stuck in a loop, a never-ending circle of hopelessness. Panic surged in her chest as she tried to run in the opposite direction, but the road led right back to the gates. She turned in every direction, searching for a way out, but no matter where she ran, she ended up right where she started. The school had trapped her in its endless maze, and it wasn't going to let her go. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she backed away from the gates. The walls seemed to close in around her, the darkness pressing tighter and tighter with every step. Evelyn realized with a sickening certainty that there was no escape. The school would not let her leave. She had been marked, and no matter how hard she tried, she was now a part of its dark, twisted ritual. The air in the school had never felt so thick, so suffocating. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she was led to the grand, foreboding hall where headmistress Morgana Vaylorn waited. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows on the walls, and the silence was deafening, broken only by the soft whispers of the school around her. It seemed as though the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone, to make the first move. Morgana stood in front of her, the dark energy of the school swirling around them, as if the walls themselves were alive and watching. "You've done well, Evelyn," Morgana said, her voice smooth and cold. "You've followed the rules, and now it's time to fulfill your destiny." The words felt like a weight pressing on Evelyn's chest, and her stomach twisted with dread. The headmistress stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling mix of pride and malice. "You were chosen the moment you arrived here. This school needs a new leader, and it has found one in you." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had known something was wrong with the school, but she had never imagined this. The school wasn't just a place of dark magic. It was alive, and it needed someone to keep it going. Someone to become the new headmistress. Morgana's smile twisted into something more sinister. "In order for the cycle to continue, a new headmistress must take my place. And you, Evelyn, are the one who has been groomed for this. You're the one who will lead this school, forever bound to it, in order to ensure its survival." Evelyn's mind raced, swirling with a maelstrom of emotions. This was it. She had been a part of this all along, and it was now clear. Her life, her very existence, was bound to the school in ways she could never have imagined. She was nothing more than a pawn in its twisted game. But there was more, something deeper, something hidden beneath Morgana's words. As if reading her thoughts, Morgana spoke again, her voice low, dangerous. "Lucian Thorncroft was a previous headmistress, a leader who was trapped within the cycle, just like you will be. He groomed you, guided you toward this moment. All those lessons, all those rules he taught you, they weren't just lessons for survival. They were to prepare you to become what you are meant to be, the new ruler of this school." Evelyn's heart sank, heavy with a truth she could hardly bear. Lucian, the mysterious teacher who had always seemed so kind, so helpful. He had been part of this all along. He hadn't just been a guide. He had been a cog in the school's sickening machine. Whether knowingly or not, he had led her to this moment, ensuring she would take the role of headmistress when Morgana's time was up. And now, she was left with a choice she didn't want to make. "You must decide, Evelyn." Morgana's voice grew more insistent, more pressing. "Take my place, or break the cycle. But know this, the destruction of the school means the destruction of everything it protects. The dark forces outside will pour in, and all who remain here will perish. You must decide what kind of future you want." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of finality. She felt the enormity of the decision bearing down on her. Too heavy to lift, too complex to understand. There was no way forward that didn't come with a cost. No way out that didn't lead to something irreversible. Evelyn felt the weight of the decision crash over her. There was no right choice. If she took the position, she would condemn herself to an eternity trapped in this place. But if she destroyed the school, everyone, the students, the teachers, the spirits of those lost, would die. It was an impossible decision, one she could not make it without facing terrible consequences, no matter the path she chose. Her mind spun with fear, confusion, her thoughts colliding in a frantic dance. She looked to Lucian, standing in the shadows, his eyes filled with an unreadable sadness. He was no longer the kind teacher she had thought he was. No, he was another soul trapped in this hellish cycle, a warning of what awaited her if she chose to take Morgana's place. She could see it in his eyes, the endless years of service, the torment of never being able to escape, never being free. Evelyn closed her eyes, trying to push away the suffocating terror that threatened to drown her. But when she opened them again, something felt different. The choice, the decision, wasn't hers to make. The walls of the school seemed to shift subtly, as though the very foundations were alive. The air grew thick with the magic that had shaped her fate. The voices of the lost students and teachers whispered in the background, their hollow cries a constant reminder of what awaited those who tried to escape. The school, it had already decided. Evelyn had always been the next headmistress. She had always been the sacrifice. Before she could speak, Morgana's smile widened, and the room seemed to darken, the air heavy with an unnatural power. Evelyn tried to take a step back, but the floor beneath her feet felt like it had turned to stone, cold and unyielding. It was too late. The school had already claimed her, and no matter how hard she fought, no matter how much she tried to escape, she was trapped. The choice had never been hers. "You are mine now, Evelyn," Morgana said, her voice almost tender, like a mother claiming her child. "You belong to the school." Evelyn's scream was swallowed by the darkness, the sound lost in the thick, suffocating air as the walls of the school closed in around her, forever binding her to its cursed halls. The cycle was complete, and there was no escape.